My son told me his pregnant wife ran off with another man, and I believed him for exactly 6 hours until I saw her at midnight, wiping down greasy tables in a place no one runs to unless they're hiding from something. And that's when I realized this wasn't a story about betrayal. It was something darker happening right inside my own house. If you're watching this right now, hit like and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, because I need to know who's still awake hearing this with me. I remember exactly how he said it. No anger, no panic, just a flat voice like he had rehearsed it too many times. "She's gone, Dad. She left with someone else. I knew it would happen." And I stood there in the kitchen, trying to match those words with the woman I had watched for months, quietly folding baby clothes before she even started showing, trying to match that accusation with the girl who always checked if I had eaten, who reminded me to take my medicine when my own son forgot it didn't fit. And I think part of me knew it didn't fit right away. But when a lie comes from your own child, you hesitate not because you believe it, but because you want to, because the truth might be worse. He didn't even look at me when he said it, just kept scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. And that bothered me more than anything, because if your wife just disappeared while carrying your child, shouldn't there be something in your face, some crack, some fear, something human? I asked him when it happened. He said early morning, before I woke up. I asked if she took anything. He shrugged, said just a bag. I asked if he called her. He said she blocked him already. Every answer came too fast, too smooth, like he had lined them up in advance. And the more he talked, the quieter I became. Because something inside me was shifting slowly but firmly. I walked past their room later that day. The door slightly open, and I stopped longer than I should have. Maybe hoping to find something that made his story make sense, but everything was still there. The blanket folded neatly, the slippers placed side by side like she had only stepped out for a moment. And that was when the first thought came, not loud, not clear, just a small, uncomfortable whisper. This doesn't look like someone who left. I didn't confront him, I didn't argue, I just watched. Because when something feels wrong, you don't rush. You wait, you let people reveal more than they mean to. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her last smile in the hallway, one hand resting on her stomach like Sikar was already protecting that child, and I kept hearing my son's voice again and again until it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like a cover around midnight. I stepped outside just to clear my head. The street was quiet, too quiet, and I walked without thinking until I ended up near a small late-night diner, a place I had passed 100 times but never entered. And I don't know why I looked inside. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was something pulling me, but when I did, my entire body froze because there she was, standing behind a table, wiping it slowly, her face pale, thinner than I remembered. And for a second I thought I was seeing things until she looked up, and the moment our eyes met, she didn't smile, she didn't call my name. She stepped back like she had just seen something she was terrified of, and that's when I knew my son had lied, and whatever he was hiding was far worse than I had imagined. Before everything fell apart, our house used to feel normal in a quiet kind of way. Not perfect, but steady. And that matters more than people admit. My son worked long hours, or at least that's what he said, and his wife stayed home most days during the early months of her pregnancy, taking care of small things, cooking, cleaning, keeping the place warm in a way I hadn't felt since my own wife passed. She wasn't loud or demanding. She moved gently through the house like she was always careful not to disturb anything or anyone, and yet somehow she was the only one who noticed everything. She noticed when I skipped a meal. She noticed when I coughed longer than usual. She noticed things my own son stopped seeing years ago. And I won't lie to you. There were moments I felt closer to her than to him. And maybe that's something I should have paid attention to Sooner, because distance doesn't just happen overnight. It builds slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you're living with a stranger and calling him your child. At first, the pregnancy seemed to soften things. He would come home earlier, some nights he would even sit beside her and ask small questions about the baby. Not out of excitement, but like he was checking off a list, like he was doing what was expected of him. And I remember thinking, maybe he just needed time. Maybe becoming a father would change him the way it changed me. But that hope didn't last long. The first real shift came in small ways. Things that didn't feel important enough to argue about, but felt wrong if you paid attention. He started asking about money more often, not in a responsible planning way, but in a controlling way. He wanted to know exactly what she spent, even when it was groceries or simple things for the baby. He would question receipts. He would check her phone casually at first, then more directly, like it was his right. And every time she would just hand it over without a word. No resistance, no complaint, just quiet acceptance. And that silence bothered me more than if they had fought, because silence usually means fear, and I started noticing how she moved around him more carefully, like she was measuring every word before speaking, like she was trying to avoid setting something off that I couldn't see. Yet there was one night, I remember clearly, we were all at the table eating dinner. Nothing special, just a simple meal, and out of nowhere. He put his chopsticks down and said, "This isn't the right time for a child." Just like that. No build-up, no context, and the room went still. She didn't answer right away. She just lowered her eyes and rested her hand lightly on her stomach, the way she always did when she felt uneasy. And I looked at him, waiting for him to explain, to soften it somehow. But he didn't. He just kept going, talking about expenses, about plans, about how things would get complicated, and every word sounded less like concern and more like rejection, like he was talking about a problem, not a child, not his child. I tried to step in, tried to calm things down, said something about how no time is ever perfect, and how we would manage. But he brushed it off like my words didn't matter. And that was the moment something shifted for me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that I started watching him more closely after that dinner. The house didn't feel the same. She spoke less. He stayed out later, and when they were in the same room together, there was a distance between them that you could feel even without looking. And I kept telling myself it was stress, that all couples go through phases, that things would settle once the baby came. But deep down, I think I already knew this wasn't stress, this was something else. Something growing in the dark, quietly taking shape. While I stood there pretending everything was still under control, and if you're still here with me, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever felt something was wrong in your own home, but couldn't prove it? Because that's exactly where I was. At that point, stuck between what I saw and what I didn't want to believe. The changes didn't come all at once. They crept in slowly, the kind you can ignore if you want to. But once you start noticing them, you can't unsee them anymore. He began checking her phone more often. At first it looked casual, like curiosity, but then it turned into something else. He would take it without asking, scroll through messages. Stand there longer than necessary, his face unreadable, and every time she would just sit quietly, waiting for him to give it back. Like she had already accepted that this was normal, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not what he was doing, but how easily she let it happen. Like she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and caught him going through her bag. He didn't even try to hide it. Just looked at me and said, "Just making sure everything's in order," and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. I remember thinking, since when does a husband talk about his wife like she's something to manage instead of someone to love? But I said nothing, because I was still trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, still trying to believe I hadn't raised someone who needed to control everything around him to feel secure. but the more I watched, the less I could defend him. He started asking her where she went, even when she only stepped out for a short walk. He wanted exact times, exact details. And if she hesitated even for a second, his tone would change. Not louder, just colder, sharper, like a quiet warning that she understood immediately, because she would answer faster after that. And I could see it in her shoulders, the way they tensed before she spoke. Like she was bracing herself for something that hadn't happened yet. There was a night I woke up to the sound of their voices through the wall, not loud enough to catch every word, but enough to feel the tension. I heard him say something about trust, about lies, about how he knew more than she thought. And then a pause followed by her voice, softer, almost shaking, saying, "I'm not lying." And then his, again lower this time, too low for me to hear clearly. But whatever he said made everything go silent after that complete silence, the kind that feels heavier than shouting. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, knowing I should get up, knowing I should check on them, but I didn't. And that's something I still think about. Because sometimes doing nothing is also a choice. The next morning, they acted like nothing happened. She was already in the kitchen, making breakfast, moving slower than usual, and he sat at the chakra table scrolling through his phone like every other day. And if you looked at them without knowing, you would think everything was fine. But I had heard enough to know it wasn't. I started paying attention to smaller details. After that, the way she avoided eye contact when he was around. The way she kept her phone close, but not too close, like she was trying to find a balance between hiding and not hiding. The way he would watch her, sometimes, not openly, just quick glances that carried more suspicion than concern. And then there were the questions he asked, that didn't sound like questions at all, more like traps waiting for the wrong answer. Who called you earlier? Why did you take so long at the store? Simple things on the surface, but there was always something underneath, something tight and controlled, like he was building a case inside his head. Piece by piece, and she was slowly losing ground without even realizing it. Or maybe she did realize it and just didn't know how to stop it. And the more I saw, the more I felt that quiet discomfort turning into something heavier, because this wasn't just a rough patch anymore. This was a pattern, and patterns don't fix themselves. They grow, and if you ignore them long enough, they turn into something you can't control anymore. And that was exactly what I was starting to fear. The first time I felt real fear, not just discomfort, not just doubt, but something cold settling in my chest, was one night when I woke up to the sound of something hitting the wall. Not loud enough to be called violence, but not soft enough to ignore either, and then his voice followed, low, sharp, controlled, the kind of voice you use when you don't want anyone else to hear, but you still want the person in front of you to feel it. I couldn't make out every word, but one sentence cut through clearly. "Just sign it, and we're done with this." And I remember sitting up in bed, staring into the dark, trying to understand what that meant, what he was asking her to sign, and why it sounded less like a request and more like a demand. There was a pause after that, long enough for me to hear her breathing, uneven, and then her voice came softer, almost breaking. "I told you I won't do that." And then silence again. But it wasn't the kind of silence that means the argument is over. It was the kind that means something has been pushed deeper, buried for later. And I stayed there listening, waiting for something else, but nothing came. And after a while, I lay back down, telling myself it was none of my business, that couples argue, that things get said in the heat of the moment. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew that wasn't the truth, because there was something in his tone that didn't belong to a simple disagreement. It belonged to control, to pressure, to something deliberate and planned. The next morning, I watched them carefully. She was already awake, moving slowly in the kitchen, her hand resting on her stomach more often than before. Like she needed to remind herself why she had to stay strong. And when I asked if everything was all right, she smiled too quickly and said she just didn't sleep well, And I wanted to believe her, I really did. But then I looked at him, sitting at the table, calm, relaxed, sipping his coffee. Like the night before had never happened. And that contrast stayed with me because one of them carried the weight of something heavy, and the other acted like nothing existed at all. Later that day I tried to bring it up, gently asked him if everything between them was okay, and he didn't even look up from his phone, just said, "It's nothing, Dad, she's just being difficult lately." And that word difficult didn't sit right with me. Not when it came to a woman carrying his child. Not when I had never once seen her raise her voice or cause trouble. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he sighed like I was the problem now, like I was the one making things complicated. She just doesn't understand what's best for us right now. And that sentence stuck with me because he didn't say what's best for her, or even what's best for the baby. He said what's best for us, but the way he said it sounded like it only meant him. I didn't push further. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I realized something important in that moment. Whatever was happening between them, he wasn't going to tell me the truth. Not directly, not honestly. And if I wanted to understand, I would have to pay attention to everything he didn't say, everything he tried to hide. And from that point on, I stopped seeing him as just my son, and started seeing him as someone I needed to watch carefully, because the man sitting in front of me wasn't the boy I remembered anymore. And whatever he was asking her to sign, whatever pressure he was putting on her, it wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The day she disappeared didn't feel like a crisis. At first, it felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet, like something had been decided long before anyone said it out loud. I woke up later than usual that morning, the house already still, and when I stepped into the living room, he was there sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone like always. No urgency, no tension. Just that same flat expression, and before I could even ask, he said it, "She's gone." Like he was telling me the weather. And I remember standing there waiting for more. Waiting for something that made it real, but he just kept scrolling until I asked what he meant. And that's when he repeated it slower this time, like he wanted to make sure I understood. "She left early this morning, took her things and ran off with someone else. I told you something was wrong with her, and I don't know why, but that last sentence bothered me more than anything, because it sounded prepared, like he had been waiting for this moment, like he needed this version of the story to be true. I asked him what time she left. He said before sunrise. I asked if he saw her leave. He said no. He was asleep. I asked if she said anything. Left a message, wrote a note. He shook his head. Every answer, simple, clean, no hesitation, and yet nothing about it felt real. I walked straight to their room after that, ignoring the way he called after me, telling me there was no point. And when I opened the door, the first thing that hit me was how unchanged everything looked. The bed still made the way she always made it. The blanket folded neatly at the edge. Her slippers still beside the bed, untouched, like she had only stepped out for a minute, not like someone who had just decided to leave her entire life behind. I opened the closet, expecting to see empty space, missing clothes, signs of packing, but most of her things were still there. Dresses, jackets, even the small bag she used almost every day still hanging in its place, and that's when something inside me tightened. Because no one runs away like that. Not while pregnant. Not without taking even the basics. I checked the bathroom. Her toothbrush still there. Her skincare lined up exactly the way she kept it. Nothing rushed. Nothing disturbed, just normal. And that word normal felt completely wrong in that moment. Because nothing about this situation was normal. I went back out to him and asked again, this time slower, more direct. What exactly did she take? And he sighed like I was being difficult now, like I was the one dragging things out. I told you, Dad, just a small bag, probably had things ready already. You didn't notice because you weren't looking. And that sentence stuck with me because it wasn't just defensive, it was shifting blame onto me, like if I questioned him enough, somehow it would become my fault for not seeing it sooner. I asked if he tried calling her. He said she blocked him immediately. I asked if he contacted her family. He said there was no point, they wouldn't know anything. And I asked if we should go to the police. And that's when he finally looked up at me for the first time, his eyes sharp for just a second, before going flat again. Why would we do that? She left on her own, there's nothing to report. And that was it. That was the moment everything stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like something was being controlled, carefully shaped into a story I was supposed to accept without digging deeper, because every normal reaction, every logical next step, he shut it down before it could even exist. And I stood there looking at my own son, realizing that whatever had happened that morning, it wasn't as simple as someone walking away. It was something planned, something managed, and whatever the truth was, he didn't want it found. And that thought stayed with me long after the conversation ended, sitting heavy in my chest. Because for the first time, I wasn't just questioning what happened to her. I was questioning who my son really was, and whether I had ever truly known him at all. That same day, I stopped asking questions out loud. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I realized he was already prepared for everything I could ask, and every response only pushed me further away from the truth. So instead, I started watching the spaces between his words, the things he avoided, the things he shut down too quickly. And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became. He didn't want her found, not by me, not by anyone, because if this was really a woman running away with another man, any normal person would be angry, would be searching, would be trying to prove something. But he did none of that. He stayed inside. He stayed calm. He stayed in control. Like the outcome was exactly what he expected. I tried once more that afternoon, bringing it up casually, saying maybe we should at least check the places she used to go, maybe call around just in case, and he cut me off before I finished. "There's no point, Dad. She made her choice. Let it go." And that phrase, "let it go," didn't sound like pain. It sounded like instruction, like he needed me to drop it so nothing else would surface. I nodded like I agreed, but inside something had already shifted. Because you don't tell people to let go when someone disappears. You say that when you want the truth buried. I went back to their room later when he stepped out, just for a few minutes, not long enough for him to expect anything, and I closed the door quietly behind me. Standing there in the silence, trying to feel what had happened in this space only hours before I moved slowly. This time not just looking, but searching, paying attention to details I had missed earlier. I opened drawers, checked behind things, looked at the small corners people forget about. And that's when I noticed the first real sign something was wrong. A stack of papers inside the bottom drawer, not placed neatly like everything else, but pushed in carelessly, like someone had tried to hide them in a hurry. I pulled them out slowly, my hands already feeling heavier, before I even saw what they were. Some pages were torn, others crumpled, but a few were still intact enough to read, and at first it didn't make sense. Legal language, names, dates, sections that felt disconnected, until one detail locked everything into place. Her name printed clearly at the top, and below it, sections about transfer ownership signatures, required authorization statements. And that was when my chest tightened, because this wasn't random. This wasn't nothing. This was something important, something serious. And I flipped through the pages faster now, scanning for context, and I saw his name too listed in places that made it clear this wasn't just paperwork. This was a process. Something he was trying to complete, something he needed her to agree to, and suddenly that sentence from the night before came back to me clear and sharp. Just sign it, and we're done with this. And now it made sense, or at least part of it. I stood there holding those papers, feeling a mix of confusion and anger building at the same time. Because if she had refused to sign whatever this was, and then suddenly disappeared the next morning. That wasn't coincidence, that was cause and effect. I put everything back exactly where I found it, making sure nothing looked disturbed, because I wasn't ready for him to know I had seen this. Not yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof, something solid enough that he couldn't twist it into another story. Later, when he came back, he acted the same as always, sat down, checked his phone, asked casually if I had eaten, like the morning hadn't changed anything. And I watched him differently now, every movement, every pause, every word, because now I knew there was something underneath everything he said, something he was protecting. And the more I thought about those papers, the more one question kept repeating in my mind. What exactly was he trying to take from her that was worth all of this? And why did it feel like the answer had something to do with that child she was carrying, the one he never really wanted, and the one she was clearly trying to protect, even if it meant running away with nothing at all? That night, I didn't wait for something to happen. I decided to move first, because once you see even a piece of the truth, you can't go back to pretending. And I knew those papers weren't the whole story. They were just the edge of something bigger. So I started paying attention to everything he touched, everything he kept close, everything he didn't want me near. He stayed in the living room longer than usual, his phone always in his hand, typing, stopping, typing again, like he was managing something in real time. And every now and then, he would glance toward the hallway, like he was making sure I hadn't moved. And that alone told me more than anything he had said all day. He wasn't relaxed. He was alert, just controlled enough to hide it. I waited until he went to shower, not long, maybe 10 minutes, but enough, and I moved quickly, not rushing, but not wasting a second. Either I went straight back into their room this time, knowing exactly what I was looking for. Not answers, yet just pieces, anything that could connect what I already knew. I checked the desk first, the drawers already familiar, but this time I went deeper under the lining, behind the stack of old receipts, inside a folder that didn't match the rest. And that's where I found it, a small envelope sealed, but not completely, like it had been opened and closed too many times. I slid it out carefully, my fingers steady, even though my heart wasn't. And when I opened it, the first thing I saw was her name again, followed by medical terms, appointment dates, and then a line that made everything inside me go cold: termination consent form. And for a moment I just stood there staring at it, not moving, not breathing, because now it wasn't just about money or control. This was about the child. The one thing she had been protecting with every quiet movement, every careful word. I flipped through the pages, quickly scanning for signatures, and hers wasn't there, just a blank line where it should have been, but his handwriting appeared in notes on the side. Dates, circled things underlined, like he was tracking progress, like this was something he was determined to finish whether she agreed or not. And suddenly everything started connecting, the arguments, the pressure, the demand to sign, the fear in her voice. The way she moved around him, like she was trying to avoid triggering something worse. And I felt something shift inside me, not confusion, not doubt, but something heavier, something closer to anger, because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore, this was deliberate, this was planned, and the worst part was how calmly he had been carrying it out right in front of me. I put the papers back exactly as I found them, sealed the envelope the same way, placed it under the same stack, because now more than ever, I needed him to keep thinking I knew nothing. When he came out of the shower, he looked at me for a second longer than usual, like he was checking something, measuring something. And I met his eyes without saying a word, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence can reveal more than questions if you use it right. He sat down again, picked up his phone, and within seconds his expression returned to that same flat, controlled calm. But now I could see through it. I could see the tension underneath, the way his jaw tightened slightly, when he typed, the way his fingers paused just a little too long, before sending something like he was choosing his words carefully, not casually, And I realized then this wasn't over, not even close, whatever he had started with her. It hadn't ended when she left. It had only shifted. And if I wanted to understand the full truth, I needed to follow it further. I needed to see where it led, and more importantly, I needed to find her before he did, because if he was willing to go this far to get what he wanted, there was no telling what he would do next. And that thought stayed with me as the night stretched on, quiet on the surface but heavy underneath, because now I wasn't just watching anymore. I was stepping into something I didn't fully understand yet, and I knew once I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed, because sometimes the only way to see the truth clearly is to let the person hiding it believe they're still in control. I made breakfast the same way I always did, sat across from him the same way I always had, and watched him without watching him. He spoke less than usual, but not in a worried way, more like someone conserving energy, like his mind was somewhere else handling something I couldn't see yet, and every now and then his phone lit up, and he would glance at it quickly, then turn the screen slightly away from me. A small movement, but one that told me more than any words could, because people only hide what matters. I asked him casually if he was going to work, he said later. Maybe not at all, said he had things to take care of, and that phrase again, things to take care of, felt too vague too. Controlled, like he didn't want to give anything concrete that I could hold on to. I nodded like I didn't care. But inside I was already planning, because if he wasn't going to work, that meant he was staying close, staying available for whatever came next. And that meant I had to be careful with every move I made. I waited until he stepped out to take a call in the hallway. His voice low enough that I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was different, sharper, quicker, less controlled than when he spoke to me. And that was enough. I moved to the table where he had left his phone just for a second, maybe two, and I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to, I only needed to see the notification that flashed across the screen before it dimmed a message from an unknown number. No name, just digits, and the words were short but clear. She's not at the old place. And in that instant, everything inside me tightened, because that meant two things. First, he was still looking for her, and second, he wasn't doing it alone. I stepped back just as he returned, his expression neutral again, like nothing had happened. But now I knew there were others involved. People helping him track her down. People who knew enough to check places she might hide. And that changed everything, because this was no longer just a private conflict inside a family. This was something wider, something organized enough that he wasn't relying on chance. He was actively hunting her, and the thought of that sent a cold wave through me. Because if he found her before I didn't know what he would do, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I kept my voice steady, asked him if everything was okay. He nodded, said it was just work, and I almost smiled at how easily. The lie came out like breathing, like he had done it so many times. It no longer required effort, and that was when I understood something important. I wasn't dealing with a man who made a mistake. I was dealing with someone who had already decided what he wanted and was willing to bend everything around him to get it. And if I wanted to stop him, I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I had to move quietly, just like he was. I had to find her first, and to do that, I needed to think like he did. Where would she go if she was scared? If she had no money, no support, no one she could trust, except maybe one person? And that thought hit me suddenly, so clear I almost said it out loud. The small places, the hidden ones, the kind you only choose when you don't want to be found. And that was when the image of that late-night diner came back to me, sharp and immediate. Because I hadn't just seen her there. I had found her there. And if she was still anywhere close, if she hadn't moved on yet, that was the place I needed to return to. Not as a coincidence this time, but as a decision, because now I knew she wasn't just hiding, she was running, and I was running out of time to reach her before he did. The smell of fried oil hit me before I even pushed the door open, and for a second, I just stood there letting my eyes adjust. Because this time I wasn't passing by, I was looking for her, and when I stepped inside, I scanned every table, every corner, every shadow until I saw her again, near the back, moving slower than before, like each step cost her something. And I walked straight toward her, not rushing, not calling her name, just closing the distance quietly until she looked up and froze the same way she had the night before. Except this time, there was no chance to turn away. No space to disappear. I said her name softly, and she shook her head immediately. Not in denial, but in fear, like even hearing it out loud was dangerous. "Please don't," she whispered. And that was the moment everything inside me shifted from suspicion to certainty, because people who run from guilt don't react like that. Only people who are hiding from something real, something close, something that can still reach them even here. She kept her eyes on the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she needed something solid to hold on to, and I lowered my voice even more. Told her I wasn't there to take her back. Told her I just wanted to understand, and for a few seconds she said nothing. Just breathed unevenly like she was deciding whether I was safe or not. And I realized then how far things had gone, because the trust she once had for me was gone, replaced by doubt, by caution, by something he had put there slowly over time. "He told me you left," I said quietly, and that made her flinch, not dramatically, just a small movement, but enough to confirm what I already knew. She wasn't expecting that version of the story. She, too, wasn't expecting me to repeat it like it was true. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely steady. "Of course he did." And those 3 words carried more weight than anything else because they weren't angry, they weren't surprised. They were resigned, like she had already accepted that he would say whatever he needed to say to protect himself. I asked her why she didn't come to me, why she didn't call, and she hesitated again, longer this time. Her eyes finally lifting just enough to meet mine. And what I saw, there wasn't distance. It wasn't coldness. It was fear mixed with something else, something like apology. "I didn't know if I could trust anyone around him," she said. And that sentence stayed with me because it meant this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about control, about isolation, about making sure she felt alone enough that running seemed like the only option. I took a step closer, lowered my voice even further, and said something I hadn't planned, but knew she needed to hear. "You can trust me now." And for the first time since I walked in, her expression changed, not completely. Not suddenly, but enough that I saw the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. Like a door opening, just enough to let something through. She looked around quickly, like she was checking if anyone was watching, and then leaned closer. Her voice almost a whisper, "He won't let me keep the baby." And everything else faded in that moment. The noise, the light, the smell, everything gone except those words, because they weren't fear of leaving, they were fear of being forced to stay. And I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Because now I wasn't just dealing with lies, I was dealing with intent and whatever. My son had planned for her. It wasn't over. It was still moving, still active, and if I didn't act fast enough, she wouldn't just disappear. She would be erased piece by piece until there was nothing left to prove she had ever tried to fight back. A chipped white mug sat between us on the metal counter, sending up thin curls of steam. Neither of us touched, and the woman behind the register kept glancing over like she could tell this wasn't a normal family conversation, but didn't want any part of it. She waited until the last customer left before speaking again. And when she did, her voice was so low I had to lean in to catch it. "He said if I didn't sign, he would make sure this baby never made it." I felt every word land like a blow, because there are some sentences a father should never hear about his own son. And that was one of them. I wanted to ask her if she was sure, wanted to cling to some smaller explanation, some misunderstanding, some ugly argument stretched too far. But the look on her face killed that impulse before it could even form. She wasn't guessing, she wasn't exaggerating, she was remembering, and the memory was still alive inside her. I asked her what he wanted, signed, and she swallowed hard before answering. Everything started with the apartment my aunt left me. He kept saying once the baby came, our expenses would grow, and we needed to put things in his name so he could manage them better. Then he started bringing other papers too, insurance forms, medical forms, things he said were routine things. He said I was too emotional to understand. She let out a short breath, then looked down at her hands, and I saw how raw her knuckles were from work, from stress, from trying to hold herself together, with nothing left to spare. At first I argued with him. Then I stopped because every time I said no, he got colder, and when he got cold, that was worse than when he yelled. That sentence told me more than anything else because anger, flares and passes, but coldness is planned. Coldness is measured. Coldness is what people use when they want to break someone without leaving obvious marks. I asked if he had ever hurt her, and she didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Then finally she said, "Not where it would show." And I had to look away for a moment, because shame came over me so fast it was almost physical shame that this had happened under my roof. Shame that I had heard pieces of it and still told myself not to interfere. Shame that she had been carrying not only a child, but fear while I sat in the next room trying to convince myself families fix themselves if left alone. I asked her why she didn't go to the police, and she gave me a tired, sad look that made me feel older than I had in years. With what proof he planned everything, he never said the worst things when anyone could hear. He used my phone sometimes. He deleted messages. He told me no one would believe a pregnant woman who was already under stress, and if I made trouble, he would say I was unstable and trying to keep him from his own child. I sat there staring at her, because that was exactly the kind of lie a clever coward builds. Not one lie, but a whole structure of them, something solid enough to trap another person inside it, and the worst part was how believable it would sound to outsiders if they only heard his version. Calm, hard-working husband, abandoned by his emotional pregnant wife. It would play perfectly, unless someone looked deeper, and most people never do. She reached into the pocket of her apron, then hesitated. And for a second, I thought she'd changed her mind. But then she pulled out a folded slip of paper worn at the edges from being handled too many times. "I took this before I left," she said, and handed it to me. It was one page from the stack I had already seen at the house, a copy of the consent form with handwritten notes in the margin. His notes, dates, and initials, and one sentence underlined twice in dark ink, "Patient refuses cooperation." At this stage, I stared at those words longer than I should have, because even on paper they sounded cruel, not like a husband speaking about his wife, but like a problem being documented, a process being managed. And suddenly I understood why she had run with almost nothing, because once someone starts reducing you to paperwork, your choices shrink fast: stay and get erased, leave and hope you can survive long enough to be believed. I asked where she had been sleeping, and she gave a small, embarrassed shrug. Different places a coworker let me. Use her couch 2 nights. Then her boyfriend got nervous, and I left. I didn't want to keep bringing trouble to anyone. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "I only took this job because they pay cash at the end of each shift." And hearing that hit me in a different way, because the girl my son had painted as some selfish runaway wasn't out hiding with another man. She was standing on swollen feet in a greasy diner working midnight shifts to protect her unborn baby from its own father. I leaned closer and told her she wasn't staying there anymore. Not one more night, not one more hour, and panic flashed across her face so quickly I had to raise a hand and calm her before she even spoke. "Not home!" I said, "Somewhere he can't reach you." She searched my face for a long moment, looking for whatever line separates pity from loyalty, because I think she had spent so long being doubted that trust itself had started to feel dangerous. And when she finally nodded, it was only once small, careful, but enough for me to know she was out of options and choosing me anyway. And that choice came with a weight I felt immediately, because from this point on, I wasn't just uncovering the truth anymore. I was responsible for what happened next, and if I failed her now, I wouldn't just lose a piece of my son. I would lose whatever remained of myself too. A loose bulb flickered above the back exit as we stepped outside, and the night air felt colder than it should have been, like the world itself was holding its breath while we moved through it. She kept close, but not too close. Her eyes scanning every passing shadow, every parked car, every reflection in the glass, like she had trained herself to expect him anywhere. And that kind of fear doesn't come from one argument. It comes from repetition, from patterns that teach you safety is temporary and danger is patient. I led her to my car without speaking, because words would only make it heavier right now. And once we were inside, she didn't relax. She sat upright, hands folded tight over her stomach. Like even sitting down was something she didn't fully trust. Yet I started the engine and drove without heading home, without even considering it, because that place was no longer safe. Not for her, and maybe not for me either, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was leaving my own life behind, just to protect what little truth I had managed to find. I took a longer route, avoiding the main roads out of instinct more than logic, and after a few minutes, she finally spoke again. "He won't stop looking." And I nodded, because I already knew that the message I had seen on his phone made that clear. This wasn't something he would let go, not after putting this much effort into controlling every piece of it. "Then we don't make it easy for him," I said, and even to my own ears, my voice sounded different, steadier, colder, more deliberate, because something inside me had shifted completely. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. We reached a small place on the edge of town, an old house that belonged to a friend of mine, someone who owed me more than a few favors, and more importantly, someone who didn't ask questions. I helped her inside, showed her the room, told her she could lock the door from the inside if she needed to, and for the first time since I found her, she hesitated at the doorway, like she didn't know what to do with a space that felt safe. "You can rest," I told her, and she nodded slowly, stepping in, but before closing the door, she looked back at me and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that night. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I almost hadn't either, and that thought sat heavy in my chest. As the door clicked shut behind her, I stood there in the quiet hallway, listening to the absence of fear for a moment, because sometimes silence can mean safety if you've earned it. And then I turned and stepped outside again, because this wasn't finished, not even close. I still had to go back to him. I still had to sit across from my own son and pretend I knew nothing while carrying everything. And that was the part that felt the hardest. Because facing a stranger is simple compared to facing someone you once loved without question. I drove home slower this time, not because I was tired, but because I was thinking through every step ahead, every mistake I couldn't afford, to make every word I would have to choose carefully, because one wrong move, and he would know, one wrong look, one wrong question, and everything would collapse before I had enough to stop him when I walked back into the house. He was exactly where I had left him, sitting on the couch, phone in hand. The glow lighting half his face while the other, shutting half, stayed in shadow. And for the first time I noticed how fitting that was, because that's exactly what he had become, someone split between what he showed and what he hid. He looked up when he heard the door asked where I had been, and I gave him the simplest answer possible. Couldn't sleep, went for a drive. He studied me for a second longer than usual, like he was measuring something, and I met his eyes without flinching, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this. He only had power as long as he believed I didn't know anything, and I wasn't ready to take that away from him yet, not until I had everything I needed to make sure he couldn't twist his way out of it later. And as I walked past him toward my room, I could feel his eyes on my back. Not curious, not concerned, but calculating, and that confirmed it for me completely, whatever game he thought he was playing. He believed he was still in control, and for now I was going to let him keep believing that, because the moment he realized the truth had already slipped out of his hands would be the moment everything he built started to fall apart, and I intended to make sure that fall hit him harder than anything he had done to her. The faint glow from his phone lit the room before his voice did, and I paused just out of sight, letting the silence stretch until he thought he was alone. Long enough to drop the careful tone he used around me. No, she won't go far. She doesn't have money. I told you, just check the places I sent. He said quietly, and something in the way he spoke made it clear this wasn't panic, this was coordination. He ended the call, and for a second, he just sat there staring at the screen like he was running through the next move in his head. Then he typed quickly, stopped, erased something, typed again, and only after he sent it did he lean back like a piece had finally fallen into place. I stepped forward, then making sure my footsteps were just loud enough to announce me, and he looked up immediately, his expression resetting so fast it almost would have been impressive if I didn't already know what sat underneath it. "You're still up," he said, and I shrugged like it meant nothing. "Couldn't sleep." I answered and walked past him without slowing down, because sometimes the best way to avoid suspicion is to act like there's nothing worth hiding at all. I didn't look back, but I could feel it, the shift in the air, the way his attention followed me, measuring every movement, like he was checking for cracks, and I gave him none. I closed my door, sat on the edge of the bed, and replayed everything I had just heard, because it confirmed what I needed most. This wasn't just pressure inside a relationship. This was a plan with moving parts, with other people involved, with steps already in motion. And that meant there would be trails, messages, patterns, things that could be traced. If I was careful enough the next morning. I woke before him, not out of habit, but because my mind hadn't really rested, and I moved through the house quietly, noticing small things I would have ignored. Before the drawer where he kept documents slightly misaligned, the faint scratch on the table where he always placed his keys, the trash bin that had been emptied, even though it wasn't full, details that on their own meant nothing, but together suggested someone managing their environment too closely, like he was trying to control what could be seen and what couldn't. I made coffee and sat down waiting, and when he finally came out, he looked normal again. Too. Normal, the same steady movements, the same flat tone as if nothing had changed. But now I knew that was his real mask. Not the calm itself, but the effort behind it, any news. I asked casually, watching his reaction more than his answer, and he shook his head almost immediately. "No, she's gone, Dad. You should accept that." And there it was again, that push to close the subject, to seal it off before it could be opened any further, and I nodded. Like I agreed, took a sip of coffee, and let the silence stretch. Because silence makes people uncomfortable when they're hiding something. They start filling it without realizing it, and right on time he added, "Even if we find her, it won't matter, she made her choice." And that sentence told me more than he intended, because it wasn't about finding her anymore. It was about controlling the narrative once she was found, shaping how everything would look from the outside, so that no matter what she said, it would already sound like an excuse. I set the cup down slowly, and looked at him not long enough to challenge him, just enough to make him aware I was still listening. And then I changed the subject. Asked about something unrelated, something ordinary, and I watched the relief pass through him so quickly he couldn't hide it completely, because as long as I stayed on the surface, he felt safe. As long as I didn't dig deeper. He believed he still had time, and that was exactly what I needed him to think. Because while he was busy managing his version of the story, I was already building mine piece by piece, and unlike his, mine wouldn't depend on control or silence. It would depend on truth. And once enough of it came together, there wouldn't be anything he could do to stop it from coming out. No matter how carefully he had planned every step up to this point, a thin line of sunlight crept across the floor and stopped at his shoes as he stood by the door, tying the laces with slow, deliberate movements, like he had all the time in the world, and I watched him from the table, realizing how strange it felt to study your own child. The way you would study a suspect, noticing the small pauses. The way his fingers tightened for a second, before pulling the knot, the way he checked his phone twice, before slipping it into his pocket, not out of habit, but out of necessity. Like whatever was inside it mattered more than anything else in the room. "I'll be out for a bit," he said without looking at me, and I nodded, keeping my voice neutral. "Work?" I asked, and he gave a short answer, something like that. Then he left, and the door closed with a quiet click that sounded far too final for something so ordinary. I sat there for a few seconds longer, letting the silence settle before moving, because timing mattered now. Every minute, every decision had to be placed carefully, and once I was sure he was far enough, I went straight to his room, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with purpose, because I already knew what I was looking for. Not answers anymore, but proof, something solid enough that when the time came he wouldn't be able to talk his way around it. I started with the desk again, but this time I didn't stop. At the obvious, I checked under the drawers, behind the panels, inside the places people use when they believe no one will ever think to look there. And it didn't take long before I found something new, a small notebook tucked behind a stack of old files. Nothing special on the outside, just plain worn edges, but inside it was different names, numbers, short notes. Written in his handwriting, dates circled, some crossed out, some underlined. And at first it looked random until I started recognizing patterns, addresses, places she had mentioned before in passing the park. She used to walk through the clinic she visited early in her pregnancy, a small grocery store near the old neighborhood, and next to each one there were marks. Some checked, some left blank, like a list being worked through step by step. And that was when it became clear this wasn't just searching, this was tracking. He had built a map of her life and was going through it piece by piece, making sure there were no places left for her to hide. I flipped through the pages faster now, my hands steady but my chest tightening with every line, because the more I saw, the more I understood how far he had gone. And then I found the page that stopped me. Completely a list of dates that matched her medical appointments, the ones she had told us about when everything was still normal, and next to the most recent one there was a note written darker than the rest, rescheduled if uncooperative. And I stared at those words longer than I should have, because they didn't sound like frustration, they sounded like a plan, like he had already prepared for her refusal. Like he had options lined up if she didn't do what he wanted. I closed the notebook, slowly placed it back exactly where I found it, because now more than ever I needed him unaware of what I knew. I stepped out of the room and stood in the hallway for a moment, letting everything settle, because this wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about stopping something that was already in motion, something that had been building quietly while I chose not to see it, and the weight of that realization pressed down harder than anything else. Because if I had paid attention sooner, if I had stepped in earlier, maybe she wouldn't have had to run, maybe none of this would have gone this far. But regret doesn't change anything. It just reminds you what's at stake. If you fail again, and I wasn't going to fail this time. I picked up my phone and stepped outside, dialing the only person I trusted to handle things that couldn't be handled quietly anymore. A lawyer I had known for years, someone who understood that truth isn't always enough on its own. It needs to be documented, structured, protected. And when he answered, I didn't waste time. I told him I needed to meet, and that it was urgent. And as I ended the call, I looked back at the house, realizing it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where something had been hidden for too long and was finally starting to surface, and this time I wasn't going to look away. I was going to drag it into the light no matter who it exposed, even if that meant tearing apart the last piece of family I had left. A glass door reflected my face back at me as I stood outside the lawyer's office, and for a second, I barely recognized the man looking back. Not because he looked different, but because of what sat behind his eyes, something heavier, something decided. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air, cool, quiet, controlled, the kind of place where problems are taken apart, piece by piece, and turned into something that can stand in front of the law without falling apart. He greeted me like he always did, calm, steady, no wasted words. And when we sat down across from each other, I didn't start with explanations. I started with facts. I told him about the papers, the consent form, the notes, the threats, everything I had seen, everything I had heard, and I watched his face carefully, because I needed to know if this sounded as serious as it felt, and the longer I spoke, the more. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough to tell me he understood what this was. "Do you have anything physical?" he asked, and I nodded, pulled out the copy she had given me, placed it on the table between us, and he didn't touch it right away. He read it first, scanned the margins, the handwriting, the wording, then finally picked it up and leaned back slightly, like he was placing it into a larger picture in his head. "This alone isn't enough," he said calmly, "but it's a start, especially with the notes and the pattern you're describing." I nodded because I expected that truth alone rarely wins without structure, without proof that can't be twisted. "He's not just pressuring her, is he?" he added, and I shook my head. "No, he's planning something. I don't know how far he's willing to go, but I know he won't stop." There was a short silence after that, not uncomfortable, just focused, and then he spoke again. "Then we don't wait for him to make the next move, we build a case before he realizes there is one." And that sentence settled something inside me, because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting with direction, with someone who knew how to turn pieces into leverage. You need more evidence, messages, recordings, anything that shows intent, not just pressure, but threat and control. If we can establish that pattern, we can protect her and the child before anything worse happens. I leaned forward slightly, and if he finds her first, he didn't hesitate, then we move faster, simple, clear, no room for doubt. And that was exactly what I needed. I left his office with a plan, not complete, not perfect, but enough to move forward, and as I stepped back onto the street, the world felt louder than before. Like everything around me had continued as normal, while my own life had shifted into something else entirely. I drove back without turning on the radio, without letting anything distract me, because every thought mattered now. Every step had to connect, and when I pulled into the driveway, I saw his car already there, which meant he had returned earlier than expected, and that told me something had changed on his side too. Maybe he had found something. Maybe he hadn't. But either way, the pace was picking up, and I couldn't afford to fall behind. I walked inside and found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his phone in hand again, always in hand. And when he looked up, there was something new in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, but suspicion. Like he was starting to feel a shift he couldn't fully explain yet. "You've been out a lot lately," he said casually. but the words carried weight, and I shrugged like it meant nothing. Just needed air. I answered, and moved past him, not giving him anything to hold on to, because now more than ever, every word had to be controlled. Every reaction measured, because the moment he knew I was no longer just the quiet father in the background, the moment he realized I had stepped into this fully, was the moment he would change his approach, and I needed him exactly where he was right now. Confident, unaware, still following the plan he believed no one else could see. Because while he was focused on finding her, I was focused on something else entirely, building the ground beneath him, just unstable enough that when the truth finally broke through, there would be nothing left for him to stand on. The sound of a message arriving broke the quiet between us, and he glanced down too quickly before turning the screen away, just enough to make it obvious without meaning to, and I caught a fragment of it in that brief second, coordinates followed by a time and nothing else. But that was enough to tell me things were moving faster than either of us wanted to admit. He slipped the phone into his pocket and straightened up like he had already decided what to do next. "I might head out again," he said, and I nodded. Like it didn't matter, though inside every instinct was sharpening, because if he was getting locations, then someone out there was feeding him information in real time. And that meant the window I had to stay ahead was closing. I walked past him toward the sink, giving him my back on purpose because people reveal more when they think you've stopped watching, and sure enough, I heard the soft tap of his phone unlocking again, the faint rhythm of typing, then a pause, then another message sent like he was confirming something. Locking it in place, I rinsed a cup slowly, buying myself a few extra seconds to think. Because this was the moment where guessing could cost everything I needed certainty, I dried my hands, turned casually, and said, "You want me to come with you?" And for a split second, he hesitated, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me because hesitation means calculation. It means the plan in his head didn't include me, and now he had to adjust it. "No, it's fine, just work stuff," he replied too quickly. And that was all I needed. I smiled, slightly nodded, and stepped away, like I believed him completely, because the more comfortable he felt, the less careful he would be, and right now, carelessness was the only opening I had. I waited until he left, until the door closed, and his car pulled away before I moved. Not rushing, not panicking, just following the sequence I had already set in my mind. I went straight to my room, grabbed my keys and my phone, and dialed the lawyer as I stepped outside. "He's moving now," I said without introduction, and he didn't ask questions. He just answered, "Then you follow, but you don't confront. Not yet, we need him to act, not just intend." I ended the call and got into my car, keeping enough distance that I wouldn't be obvious, but close enough not to lose him, because whatever location he had just received was important enough to pull him out immediately, and that meant it mattered. I followed him through streets I knew well, and others I hadn't paid attention to in years, until he finally slowed near a row of older buildings, the kind people pass without looking twice, and parked a little further down, stepping out with his phone already in hand, scanning the area not nervously, but with purpose, like he expected something to be there. I stayed back watching through the windshield as he moved toward one of the entrances, paused, looked at the screen again, then stepped inside, and that was when I realized this wasn't random. He knew exactly where he was going, and whoever sent that message knew exactly where she might be. I stepped out of the car a minute later, keeping my distance as I approached the same building, every step measured, every sound controlled. Because one mistake, now one wrong move, and everything would collapse before I had enough to stop him. I reached the entrance just in time to see the door closing behind him, and for a brief second, I stood there listening to the echo of his footsteps fading upward through the stairwell, and I understood something clearly in that moment. Whatever waited inside that building wasn't just another guess on his list. It was something closer, something real. And if I was right, then the next few minutes weren't just about finding the truth anymore. They were about deciding who would reach it first, and what would happen when they did. A narrow stairwell carried every footstep upward, and the echo made it impossible to tell how far ahead he was. So I slowed my pace, letting the sound settle before moving again, because rushing now would only give me away, and I needed to see before I acted. The hallway above was dim, one flickering light near the end, and a row of doors that all looked the same, except one slightly open, just enough to let a thin line of light spill into the corridor. And I didn't need to guess, I already knew that was where he had gone. I moved closer, keeping to the side until I could hear voices inside his low, controlled tone. First, then another voice, softer, strained hers, and that alone was enough to tighten something in my chest, because I had hoped I was wrong about this location. But hope doesn't change reality. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Seong said. And even without seeing his face, I could picture the way he delivered it, calm, patient. Like he was explaining something reasonable, not forcing something cruel. "I told you I won't sign anything," she answered. And there was no strength left in her voice, only exhaustion. And that scared me more than anger would have, because exhaustion means someone has been pushed too far for too long. I stepped closer until I could see through the gap in the door, just enough to catch the scene inside. She was backed near the wall, one hand over her stomach, the other gripping the edge of a small table, like it was the only thing keeping her steady, and he stood in front of her, blocking the exit, not touching her, but close enough that space itself had become a threat. His phone was in his hand screen, lit, displaying something I couldn't fully see but I didn't need to, because his next words made it clear. "We can finish this today. You sign, we go to the clinic, and everything goes back to normal." Normal, that word again, twisted into something unrecognizable, and she shook her head immediately, stepping back even though there was nowhere left to go. "This is my child," she said, and I saw his expression shift just slightly. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper. Something impatient, like he was running out of tolerance for resistance. "It's a problem," he replied, and that was the moment any last hesitation inside me disappeared, because no father should ever hear his own son speak about his child like that. I pushed the door open before he could say anything else, and the sound alone was enough to make both of them turn. She looked at me first, shock flooding her face, followed by something else, relief so sudden it almost broke her, and he turned slower, his eyes locking onto mine with a calm that lasted only a second before cracking into something darker. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and I stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind me, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make it clear this wasn't something he could walk away from anymore. "That's my question," I said, keeping my voice steady because losing control now would only give him room to twist things back into his favor. He let out a short breath, then straightened slightly, like he was resetting again, trying to take back control of the situation. "You don't understand what's going on," he said, and I almost laughed at that because I had heard those exact words too many times already from him, and every time they meant the same thing. Stop asking, stop looking, stop thinking for yourself, no. I answered quietly. I understand exactly what's going on, and for the first time since I walked in, I saw something real in his face. Not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, just a flicker, but enough because uncertainty is where everything starts to fall apart. He glanced at her, then back at me, calculating, measuring, trying to decide if he could still shift this into something else. But there was no space left for that now. Not with both of us standing there, not with the truth already sitting in the room between us. "You're overreacting," he said finally. And that was his last attempt to shrink it, to make it sound smaller than it was, but I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice, I just looked at him and said, the one thing he couldn't ignore anymore. I've seen the papers. And that was it. That was the point where everything changed. Because the moment those words left my mouth, the control he had been holding on to snapped, not loudly, not violently, but completely. And in that silence that followed, I knew whatever came next. There would be no more pretending, no more careful lies, no more distance between what he was and what he had been trying to hide, because now it was all exposed, and there was no way back from that for either of us. A chair leg scraped against the floor as he shifted his weight, and that small, harsh sound seemed to cut whatever control he had left into pieces, because from that point on, he stopped pretending, not completely, not cleanly, but enough that the calm mask he had been wearing began to slip in ways he couldn't fix. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he said, and this time there was no effort to soften it, no attempt to make it sound reasonable. It came out flat-edged and honest in a way that told me everything I needed to know. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us because sometimes silence forces people to fill it, and sure enough he did. This was under control. He continued glancing toward her like she was the source of the problem, not the victim of it. She just needed to cooperate and none of this would have happened. Cooperate, the word hung in the air heavier than anything else because it stripped away the last bit of illusion. There was no misunderstanding here, no confusion, just a plan that required her to give up everything for his benefit. And when she refused, he decided to force it one way or another. "You call this control?" I asked quietly, and he didn't hesitate. "Yes." And that single word confirmed what I had already accepted inside me. This wasn't my son arguing. This was someone who believed he had the right to decide for everyone else. Someone who saw people not as equals, but as obstacles or assets, depending on whether they obeyed him. "You were going to take her to that clinic without her consent," I said, and his jaw tightened slightly, not in denial, but in irritation, like I had skipped ahead in a conversation he wasn't ready to have yet. "It would have been easier for everyone," he replied. And there it was again, that twisted version of logic, where harm becomes convenience and control becomes care. I took a step forward, placing myself fully between him and her. Not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a line. And I felt her move slightly behind me, not touching, not speaking, just trusting that for this moment I would hold that line. And that trust carried more weight than anything else in the room. "It ends here," I said. And for a brief second, he just stared at me like he was trying to process the fact that I was no longer part of the structure he had built. No longer someone he could dismiss or redirect. And then his expression hardened again. Not calm, not controlled, but defensive. "You think you can just walk in and ruin everything," he said, and I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm stopping you from ruining everything else." And something in that sentence must have landed deeper than the others, because his next move wasn't words, it was action. He stepped forward faster than before, closing the space like he wanted to force a reaction out of me. But I didn't move. I held my ground, because backing away now would only give him what he wanted. Control through pressure. And we stood there closer than we had ever been. Not as father and son, but as two people on opposite sides of something that couldn't be fixed. "Move," he said, low and direct, and I answered just as quietly, "No." And for a second, I thought he might push past me, might try to force his way through, but instead he stopped, his eyes shifting between me and her, calculating again, searching for an angle that no longer existed, because the moment I stepped into that room, the balance had changed. He wasn't dealing with someone he could isolate anymore. He was exposed, and he knew it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside broke the tension just enough to shift everything again. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough because he heard it too. And his expression changed once more. Not fear, but awareness, because now there were witnesses, possibilities, variables he couldn't control. And that's when I saw it clearly, the realization settling into him that this wasn't something he could contain anymore, that whatever he had been building in silence was now at risk of being seen by others, of becoming something real and public. And that was the one thing he hadn't planned for. I reached into my pocket, then slowly, deliberately, and pulled out my phone. Not to threaten, not to escalate, but to make something clear without saying it out loud. And when he saw it, his eyes narrowed just slightly, because he understood what it meant. This wasn't just between us anymore. This wasn't just a private conversation that could be twisted or buried. This was something that could be recorded, documented, turned into evidence. And for the first time since all of this started, he stepped back not far, not dramatically, but enough to show that the control he had been holding on to was finally slipping through his hands. And in that small step backward, everything shifted. Because it wasn't just distance. It was the beginning of the end of whatever power he thought he had, over her, over me, over the story he had been trying to write from the start. And I knew then we weren't done yet, but the direction had changed completely, and this time, he wasn't the one leading it anymore. Sirens didn't arrive like a rescue. They arrived like a mirror, because once the sound reached the hallway, there was no way to pretend this was still private. No way to shrink it back into something manageable. And I watched his face as that reality settled in. Not panic, not regret. Just a hard, quiet recalculation. Like he was already searching for the next version of the story that might still save him, but there wasn't one left, not anymore. I stepped aside just enough to give space as the door opened, and two officers moved in their presence. Steady, neutral, the kind that doesn't react to emotion because they've seen too much of it already. One of them looked at her first, took in the way she stood, the way her hand never left her stomach. The other looked at me, then at him, and asked the simplest question possible. What's going on here? And for a second, no one answered because the truth has a weight to it that silence can't hold for long. And then she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. He's been trying to force me to sign papers and take me to a clinic I don't want to go to. And that was enough. Not the whole story, not every detail, but enough to shift everything from accusation to something that required attention. I handed over the copy of the form, the one she had kept the notes in the margins, his handwriting, and watched as the officer scanned it slowly, then looked up at him. Not accusing, not assuming, just measuring. And he tried one last time to step back into control. This is a misunderstanding. She's under stress. He said the same line, the same structure, the same attempt to reduce everything into something small and manageable. But it didn't land the same way now. Not in that room, not with witnesses, not with evidence sitting in someone else's hand. The officer nodded slightly, like he had heard it before, which I'm sure he had, then asked a few more questions, simple, direct. And every answer she gave was steady, every word grounded in something real, while his began to shift. Small changes, small adjustments, like he was trying to rebuild the narrative as he spoke. But once a story starts changing in front of people, it loses its strength quickly, and I could see that happening to him in real time. The more he talked, the less certain he sounded. Not because he was afraid, but because he was losing the structure he depended on. The officer finally asked him to step outside for a moment, and he hesitated just long enough to show he didn't like being told what to do anymore. Then he moved past me without looking back, and when the door closed behind him, the room felt different. Lighter, not safe yet, but closer to it. She let out a breath she had been holding for too long and sat down slowly, like her body was finally catching up with everything her mind had been carrying. I stayed where I was, not rushing to comfort, not filling the space with words, because sometimes the best thing you can give someone after they've been pushed that far his room to feel something, other than fear after a few minutes. The officer returned, spoke to her again more gently. This time explained what would happen next, what steps could be taken, what protections were available, and for the first time since I had found her, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear or exhaustion. It was something smaller but stronger, something like relief mixed with disbelief, like she hadn't expected this moment to actually come. I stepped outside after that and found him standing at the end of the hallway talking in low tones, his posture stiff, his movements tighter than before. And when he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Just looked at me like he was trying to understand how everything had slipped out of his control so completely. And I looked back at him, not as a father, not as someone searching for the boy he used to be, but as someone who had finally seen the truth clearly and accepted it for what it was. "You chose this," I said quietly, and for once he had no answer. Not because he couldn't think of one, but because there wasn't one left that would change anything. The process moved forward after that statement's taken steps, initiated things set into motion that couldn't be undone quietly anymore. And as I stood there watching it unfold, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not victory, but a kind of clarity, because sometimes the hardest part isn't uncovering the truth. It's accepting what it means. Once you do, he wasn't the person I thought he was. And maybe he hadn't been for a long time. And I had just chosen not to see it until now. And that realization didn't break me. It settled into place like something that had been waiting to be acknowledged for too long. I went back inside before leaving, looked at her one more time and said what I should have said much earlier. "You're not alone anymore." And she nodded slowly, holding on to those words like they mattered, because now they did. And as I walked out of that building, I didn't look back. Not because it didn't matter, but because I already knew what I had to do next. Protect her, protect that child, and let the truth do what it was always meant to do once it was finally allowed into the light. If you've stayed with me until the end, tell me what you would have done in my place. Because sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we have to stand against. And that choice is never as simple as it sounds.